The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents Did Jesus Rise from the Dead? A debate between Matt Dillahunty and Blake Giunta. The following debate took place August 6, 2016 and was sponsored by the Bible and Beer Consortium in Dallas, Texas.
Tonight's topic, did Jesus rise from the dead? Before I introduce tonight's speakers, please listen carefully. Blake and Matt have communicated that they want to very carefully protect the cordial atmosphere of tonight's discussion. This isn't a debate between enemies, but between friends who love to talk about the subject. I think you're going to see the respect these two have for each other, and we want to emulate that as an audience. So Blake and Matt have requested a strict no cheering policy. This doesn't mean that after Blake or Matt present their initial positions, you don't erupt with applause. Please do. Let's practice that. Ladies and gentlemen, Blake Giunta. Ladies and gentlemen, Matt Dillahunty. That is a quite feculent response, but we'll work on it. Now, to be clear, we are not demanding or expecting complete silence. People are going to politely applaud. Politely applaud. Or groan. Or even laugh. Some of you, after all, are drinking beer. But this isn't the Roman Colosseum. Are we clear? This doesn't mean that after Matt tells a good joke, you don't laugh. Again, please do. But per Mr. Dillahunty, no one in this room is allowed to make Matt Dillahunty look bad. He alone has that privilege. Tonight's first speaker is Blake Giunta. Blake is founder of BeliefMap.org, a dialogue simulator designed to map points and counterpoints in debates on issues like God's existence and Jesus' resurrection. He's been studying philosophy and apologetics as an enthusiast for over a decade. Blake is also a Texas state champion wrestler, but mostly enjoys beating people at StarCraft and Halo. Speaking to the topic, did Jesus rise from the dead? Please welcome Blake Giunta.
Well, hey guys, glad you're here. I don't know about you, but I've been looking forward to this debate for a long time. Two reasons. First, we get to have Matt back, which is awesome. I think he's going to come down so we can see our slideshow here. And second, in my opinion, we're debating the most important topic we can. Christianity can survive even if there are 1,000 Bible contradictions. But as Paul says, quote, if Christ has not been raised, then your faith is in vain. And yet if Jesus did rise, well, we're going to get to that. So I have a lot to share with you guys, and I'm just going to jump right in. My argument tonight is very simple. It goes like this. Step one, shortly after Jesus' death, disciples and enemies of his were proclaiming, God has raised Jesus. He just met with us. And step two is simply going to argue that they were right. They weren't lying or deceived. And so how do we establish step one? Tonight, we only have time to look at two sources. The first is the 1 Corinthians 15 Creed. So this book is a 718-page doctoral dissertation on the appearance evidence for the resurrection that we're going to be talking about tonight. And these 13 pages are the summary of contemporary scholarship on this creed. And you can see from all the citations that a lot of research has been done on this. So what is this creed? Well, contextually, Paul is writing to the church in Corinth, and he says, you guys, you know our creedal statement, that Christ died and that he was buried, then raised, and then that he appeared to Peter and then to the 12 apostles. And what's powerful about this creed is that literally over 99% of scholars accept that it circulated from the beginning of the Jesus movement. For example, the Jesus Seminar consists of about 150 non-Christian New Testament scholars, and they conclude, quote, on the assumption that Jesus died about 30 CE, the time for development was thus 2 or 3 years at most. The Oxford Companion to the Bible. It is certainly not later than Paul's visit to Jerusalem in 35 CE. And it is widely accepted that this creed was formed in Jerusalem. And this is why it is so commonly said that this creed can be considered a statement of eyewitnesses. The evidence unilaterally puts the apostles in Jerusalem around AD 30, proclaiming that Jesus really appeared to them. And we can reach the same conclusion with our second source. Acts chapter 2 records a famous speech given by Peter to a crowd in Jerusalem. So this is just after Jesus' crucifixion. It's a huge festival, and the apostles are proclaiming that, quote, this Jesus God raised up, to which we are all witnesses. Is that true, though? Did they really say this? To build our trust in Acts 2, I'm going to give 4 reasons to trust Luke Acts in general. Now, if you don't know already, the books of Luke and Acts together are called Luke Acts because it's a 2-volume work by the same author. Now, whether the author is actually Luke, Professor Brown says scholarship's evenly divided. But no one denies that they have the same author. Tonight, we're just going to call him Fred. In Luke 1:1, Fred says his material has been carefully grounded in eyewitness testimony. And for several reasons, quote, this biographical understanding of the gospel genre has now become the accepted scholarly consensus. Fred claims to have used eyewitness testimony. In fact, guys, in Acts 21, Fred says he personally joins Paul during Paul's 3rd visit to Jerusalem, where all the witnesses are. He says, quote, after we arrived in Jerusalem, the brethren received us. If he's telling the truth about this, you're going to see that we have a very good case for the Acts 2 speech. Now, there is no reason to think that Fred's lying, but we can start to check anyways by seeing if he really uses Paul as an eyewitness like he says. We're going to see that Fred actually traveled with Paul and knew verifiable things that he could only have gotten from Paul. So, first, remember, Fred just said, we arrived in Jerusalem. And while there, Paul is arrested, but he ends up invoking his right as a Roman citizen to go on trial in Rome. And then Fred says, quote, we put out to sea, and they started from Jerusalem, went to Caesarea, to Sidon, to Myra, and from there, they transferred to a Greek Alexandrian grain ship. So some background here. As Fred said earlier, there was a famine, quote, during the reign of Claudius. We verified this. And we know that Claudius established this grain fleet that would truck up to 150,000 tons of corn from a Greek city called Alexandria in Egypt. So anyway, the Roman centurion transfers these prisoners to one of these Alexandrian grain ships, and they end up at Crete. So now, as a taste of the authenticity of this voyage, let me give you 5 evidences. First, from here at Crete, they're trying to get from this green dot to the blue dot. And as they, quote, sailed along Crete close to the shore, soon a tempestuous wind called the northeaster struck down from the land. And here's our first evidence. This is a well-confirmed wind that rides over Crete from the northeast, strongest at this exact time near Passover. Here's our second evidence. Fred says, quote, we were driven to a small island called Cauda. Now, what's impressive here is that this purple dot island is about 90 miles from the green dot. And ancients found it nearly impossible to properly locate islands this far out. So Ptolemy and Pliny had the estimates in Fred's day, and both would have been thought at the time to debunk Fred's claim here. However, it's Fred's report alone that gets the implied location of the island right. Hemer says, quote, it becomes increasingly difficult to believe that such details could have been derived from any kind of contemporary reference work. Our third evidence is the accurate fear of running aground on the shoals of Syrtis. And fourth, we know Fred is carefully describing in layman's terms various measures taken by the crew, and yet Fred describes them without necessarily understanding them. So for example, Fred says ropes were wrapped around the ship, but he's clueless about how desperate these measures were. Fifth, scholars have written on these Latin nautical terms that have made their way into Fred's account. But how is Fred hearing Roman language on a ship of Alexandria? Isn't that dumb? No, Alexandrian ships, remember, are under the imperial service at this time, which Fred didn't even tell us. And a centurion with prisoners like Paul would be able to get on. Keener says it would be the fastest way to get to Rome. And this is just a taste. I'm going quick, and I've had to cut out 90% of the travel evidence. We can show that Fred has a Pauline knowledge of the world as well. Remember that prior to this voyage, Fred was traveling all over the world. We can also show, back up here. Yeah, so this guy dedicated his life to proclaiming how Jesus appeared to him and transformed him. So this is the newest commentary on Acts published by Baker Academic, and it cites 45,000 extra biblical references. There's obviously no way to summarize all this, but in a nutshell, Fred's account identifies 110 individuals by name, several of which are verified through some extra biblical source. And not only that, he gets the details about them right. For example, as the Oxford Companion to the Bible points out, quote, "Scholars have drawn attention to the accuracy with which officials are designated by their correct titles, an accuracy the more noteworthy because some of those titles changed from time to time." So at Cyprus, Fred rightly calls the magistrate a proconsul, but at a different time, he'd be called an imperial legate or propraetor. Fred also accurately references 32 countries, 54 cities, and 9 islands, and there's more. Paul's evangelism and realistic travel itinerary fits eyewitness acquaintance based on geography, specific ports and what you see when arriving, local customs, time of the year, the status of the church's expansion at that time, and more. Trites and Larkin explain, quote, "He is given high marks, even by skeptical critics, for his factual fastidiousness when it comes to geographical, social, and political minutiae. It is anachronistic to take this accuracy simply as the result of the kind of research a good historical novelist would do. In the first century, there were no reference works that would make such research possible." And it's not just these random trivia facts. The book of Acts gets right what scholars call the local color. So, for example, this building is the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus. And Fred accurately captures the Ephesians' current economic concerns for that very temple, as well as the Ephesians' unique way of saying God, the likely presence of silversmiths in the relevant area, their local concern for defending the Artemis cult, and the very real tendency of Ephesians to riot and drag people to the theater. And again, this is just a taste. You've got stuff like this for almost every city, including the small ones, just as if Fred really did get his information from Paul. One specialist insults the book of Acts and yet confesses, quote, "But any attempt to reject its basic historicity, even in matters of detail, must now appear absurd." The final evidence for Fred working with Paul is this. Fred also had a Pauline knowledge of Paul's personal life. Quick example, in Galatians, Paul recounts how he used to persecute the church. However, quote, "After a revelation of Jesus Christ," and watch the red text here, "I went away to Arabia and returned once more to Damascus. After 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to become acquainted with Peter, and I stayed with him 15 days. But," Paul admits, "I did not see any of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. I was still unknown by sight to the churches of Judea, but only they kept hearing, 'He who once persecuted us is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy.'" Now, if you take Paul's letter and compare it to Fred's account, you'll see what's clearly the same series of events. Paul persecutes Christians, heads for Damascus. Jesus appears to him on the way, converts him. Paul later goes to Jerusalem to see if the church leaders there for the first time, and they know of Paul by reputation. So they agree on all that. But Fred's detailed account seems to have no awareness of those juicy red details. And this fits the scholarly consensus that Paul's letters weren't collected together at this time for Fred to use. And the best explanation of this tacky sort of correspondence is simply that Fred knew Paul. He didn't need or use the letters. So with these 3 evidences, we have a good case that Fred was not lying about working with Paul. So Luke Acts claims to be grounded in eyewitness testimony from Jerusalem. Certainly we've confirmed that with Paul's life. They were there together. And here's our third evidence that Fred knew and used Jerusalem witnesses, which again will get us Peter's Acts 2 speech. which in turn is our second source for establishing step one, that the apostles were really proclaiming Jesus met with us. So in 2002, a new lexicon came out. And looking at all these inscriptions on tombs, we've put together a sort of telephone book of 3,000 Jewish names in Jesus' time and the people who bore them. So a professor at Cambridge University used this new material to test John, Mark, Matthew, and Luke Acts to see if the names lined up with Palestinian names in the way that eyewitness testimony would. Well, what names are popular and to what degree at this exact time and place? It turns out the ratios match gloriously with the Gospels and Acts, and correspondence like this would be, quote, impossible to explain as the result of such invention out of Jewish Palestine, end quote. For example, if you compare the Gospels and Acts with the Jewish names in Egypt or anywhere else, this gorgeous correspondence gets obliterated. So this too should boost our confidence in Fred and the Acts 2 speech. This was a very famous speech, and Acts reports that many Christians in Jerusalem and those visiting for Pentecost traced their conversion to it. Frankly, every church knew full well whether the apostles were saying that Jesus appeared to them or not, because they would be checking with each other. Every Christian wanted to be in agreement with Jesus' apostles, and Jesus' apostles wanted them to be. But, interesting twist, we didn't need any of that Fred stuff to know the Acts 2 speech traces to the Jerusalem apostles. The speech, quote, exhibits Semitic features and primitive characteristics that we can trace to the congregation at Jerusalem. The Oxford Bible Commentary says it, quote, falls into a distinctive pattern analyzed in Dodd's classic study. And now Dodd was a professor at Cambridge. He didn't say that we can know Peter gave this speech just from these details. But he says we can know, quote, with some confidence that it represents, quote, the kerygma. This is the kernel preaching of the church at Jerusalem at an early period. So I don't have the exact numbers, but Byerskog says the consensus of New Testament scholars has moved away from skepticism to a general acknowledgement that Fred depends on earlier material for this speech. He didn't just make it up. And of course, this too builds into Fred's reliability. So we have a good case for the Acts 2 speech and its charismatic message in general, meaning the apostles really were historically testifying that, quote, he appeared to us. And everyone knew that's what they were saying. Let me add that contextually, Acts 2 represents an appearance of them to them as a group. We can get everything we need, including group appearances, without even mentioning the Gospels. We got it from the 1 Corinthians 15 creed as well, remember, that Jesus appeared to Peter by himself and then the 12 as a group, which also fits Fred's first account, by the way. He appeared to Peter and then to the rest of the apostles. So, step one, shortly after Jesus' death, disciples and enemies of his really were proclaiming, God raised Jesus, he just met with us. Step two, they were right. So, for example, they weren't lying. The apostles weren't maliciously trying to turn the world against the true God. They got nothing and sacrificed everything because they were convinced. Gary Habermas writes, quote, on the state of resurrection studies today, I recently completed an overview of more than 1,400 sources on the resurrection of Jesus published since 1975. I studied and cataloged about 650 of these texts in English, German, and French. Some of the results of this study are certainly intriguing. For example, perhaps no fact is more widely recognized than that early Christian believers had real experiences that they thought were appearances of the risen Jesus. A critic may claim what they saw were hallucinations or visions, but he does not deny that they actually experienced something. The apostles lost their Messiah to crucifixion, and then suddenly something changed them. Paula Fredrickson's an expert on this. She echoes the sentiment of literally every non-Christian who teaches on early Christianity. Quote, I don't know what they saw, but I do know as an historian that they must have seen something. This picture is a picture of Stephen getting stoned, by the way, which every Christian knew was a real possibility right from the beginning. Jesus faced it, Paul faced it, and Paul himself oversaw stonings. The go-to academic dictionary on Jesus says, quote, all historians are confident that very shortly after Jesus was crucified, his disciples became convinced by multiple visionary appearances of Jesus, and they believed that God had restored his life. So, they were at least convinced of what they saw. They weren't lying. But did Jesus fake his death and pretend that he resurrected? So I run beliefmap.org, which is sort of a flow chart on steroids. And inside, you can explore this debate over Jesus' resurrection. And since time is short, I'm just giving you a preview. First, Jesus would look half dead. The apostles would know instantly what happened. They'd be screaming for a doctor. As Strauss says, quote, "It could by no possibility have changed their sorrow into enthusiasm, have elevated their reverence into worship." Second, on Belief Map, you're going to see 4 reasons Jesus wouldn't even try. Third, escaping the tomb from inside was impossible. And fourth, Jesus demonstrably died on the cross. No one survives crucifixion. On Belief Map, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4 proofs for this, which I think are rather compelling put together. So this theory was popular in German New Testament scholarship, but it is now totally discredited. Okay, so then what about this look-alike imposter idea? One professor, interestingly, actually did his doctoral dissertation trying to defend this hypothesis against the resurrection hypothesis. And this is actually going to be on Belief Map soon, but briefly, for several reasons, an imposter would not be able to trick the church persecutor Paul. Nor could he trick James, the biological brother of Jesus, nor the Jesus' apostles. And there are 8 more huge problems signifying the same exact conclusion. This is also discredited. Okay, so what about the hallucination hypothesis? This, I don't know if you knew, this is the most popular naturalist explanation among historians today. This is also going to be on Belief Map soon, but in a nutshell, problems abound, and here are 2. First, for several reasons, they would have known it was a hallucination. And second, hallucinations are like dreams. You can't share them and co-hallucinate. Carrier argues that they were simply congregating schizotypals, and schizotypals hallucinate more often. But it's easy to show the apostles weren't schizotypals. And in fact, Carrier's attempt just adds 6 more problems, and the original problems remain. For example, schizotypals also never group hallucinate. I'm going to leave the illusion hypothesis and futuristic alien technology hypothesis for Q&A. But with just 2 sources, I think we've got a really good starter case. Now, people do exist who think that any of these explanations is better than saying that God raised Jesus, and that's because nobody comes to this question in a vacuum. According to the CIA's World Factbook, 2% of people do believe that there is no God of any kind. In America, it's 3%. If you are entirely confident that no God exists, then maybe group hallucination is more sensible for you. I don't think you're automatically irrational, but I would question where the confidence comes from. And that's why, if this is you, I would have loved to spend hours chatting about God's existence first. It's where I do most of my reading. On this, I recommend Belief Map again and the Oxford philosopher Richard Swinburne's book, Does God Exist?, the 2nd edition. Also, a striking number of lay atheists believe that there was never a historical Jesus either. Matt himself is agnostic about it, so I would give a lecture on that too, and why today there's not one teaching historian in the world, at Cambridge, Harvard, Oxford, anywhere, who doubts Jesus' existence. So I think God exists and Jesus is a real historical figure, but there's an important last question, which is, would God raise Jesus? I think the best explanation simply says, look around. Dead people stay dead. If there is a God, raising people from the dead obviously isn't his style. And so in response, I want to explain why Jesus is special and why God might uniquely choose to raise Jesus from death. I only have time to skim this, but I do want to address it. I think that the philosopher is obligated to ask if becoming incarnate and saving humanity and resurrecting is the kind of thing that God would do. So let me summarize what would be my first lecture. If God exists, I would argue it's not improbable that God would create these very valuable things called moral agents with free will so they can love God freely. And if God creates moral agents with free will, it's not improbable that they would abuse it and do evil. And if this happens, it's not improbable that a holy and just God would need to find a way to answer past evil and ultimately eliminate all evil. Well, the only way for an agent to freely love God and yet never sin so that evil can be eliminated is to give that agent freedom. and then woo that agent into freely hating sin on his own so the agent can freely choose, God, you are good, and I'm not. And I want to submit my freedom back to you. Transform me. Take control. And that's philosophically the only way you can get and keep both, agents who have freely chosen to love God, and two, the elimination of all future evil. And finally, for these free agents, I think God would need to find a way to deal with their past sin. And I believe in doing this, through Jesus, God has fulfilled his role as the greatest possible being. And I'm going to skip through a couple of these because I think time is short. Yeah, I'll go back here. Yeah, I give a third lecture on foreshadowing Jesus through Israel's formation. So let's quickly consider three formative events of Israel, these stories of which predate... No, I'm going to skip this too. I'm at 30 minutes about, right, Ezra? Yeah, hold on, I got to skip past this. I apologize. Yeah, I'll go here. Basically, these are several lectures that would set up why I think God might raise Jesus. Finally, I give a fourth lecture on how Jesus stands today as the moral exemplar for humanity. This image is Jesus about to talk with a Samaritan woman. He asked her for a drink, and she said, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria?" So that she was a woman was bad enough, but few readers realize how much Jews hated Samaritans. It was like a gang war. So when Jesus taught on the commandment to love your neighbor as yourself, and a Jew asked, "Who's my neighbor?" how revolutionary is it for Jesus to tell of a good Samaritan? Jesus said, when a Roman forces you to carry his stuff for a mile, in love carry it for 2 miles. Jesus broke down barriers, not just with women, Samaritans, and Gentiles. He did it with the poor and the tax collectors and the most hated sinners of all. And against all conventions, Jesus was a king and rabbi who would say, "Father, forgive them," to his murderers while they're murdering him. He was a king who washed his disciples' feet. Contemporary Romans and Jews did not find this appealing. Neither one, I would argue, could be a natural source for this revolutionary ethic. It's almost like Jesus was out of this world. And he said he was. So I give a fourth lecture on how most specialists believe Jesus actually claimed to be either God or, like Bart Ehrman argues, at least a divine figure. Claimed to be a divine figure who received worship and gave divine forgiveness. And I'd give a fifth lecture asking what sane rabbi with the moral fortitude of Jesus says that kind of thing about himself. Does such a malicious lie fit with the character and sanity of Jesus? This is the man who Paul says appeared to him and transformed him, who the apostles went to their graves proclaiming, "He appeared to us." I think that to avoid him tonight, you're going to hear an objection that either denies all contemporary scholarship on the issue or else endorses something like group hallucination. Thank you, and with that, I'll turn it over to Matt. Thank you very much.